I have strong hopes that if there is one, then the conviction might be set aside. I don't know that it will, because I don't know or claim to know that Lucy Letby is innocent. As I say, I'm just worried that the verdict as it stands is unsafe, that evidence hasn't been produced which justifies the verdict, and it simply cannot, to me, and I think this is the problem for any person of conscience in any country where there are prisons. To imagine that there are people in prison who are there who shouldn't be is bad enough.
Her original trial, which ended last August, had been among the longest murder trials in English legal history. And the police investigation that preceded it, known as Operation Hummingbird, was scrutinising sort of 500,000 medical documents. They spoke to more than 2,000 people. And that operation continues. But what is continuing and gathering momentum, really, are people like David Davis who have those questions. And Peter, take us back to last August, because you had those questions at the time. How difficult was it to voice them?
Not difficult, because I'm used to being unpopular and not running with the crowd. And therefore, when it increasingly came to me that there was something wrong with this trial and its outcome, and that's what I felt then, feel now, that it was a simple matter of saying very shortly after the first trial concluded that I thought that it was questionable and that I had serious doubts about whether Miss Letby was guilty. And I thought I should say so, because the sooner you say these things, the sooner something will be done about it. All that anybody can do in a case like this is express doubts and then hope that the machinery of the law will take those doubts into consideration and that it will be re-examined, which I still hope will happen. Then almost immediately the second trial began, in which it was impossible for many months to say anything at all. In this country anyway, though there was a huge development in the United States when Rachel Aviv in the New Yorker produced an extraordinary and immensely powerful article, which I still hope will become readily available in this country. It's not that hard to find. I've obviously obtained it and read it, which went right through the case very thoroughly indeed. She actually obtained, at a vast expense, the transcript of the entire trial, and she interviewed a number of people closely involved in it, and produced an article of what I think is first-rate journalism, which again cast doubt upon the verdict of guilty. And then it began to snowball, very encouragingly for those of us who feel that something needs to be done. Both The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph produced long articles quoting experts who doubted considerably that the evidence given was adequate to convict. And then Private Eye and its esteemed Dr. Phil has produced two very long articles in which he's expressed strong doubts. And I am just one among many who's saying that there is something worrying here. And of course, David Davis has actually at one point raised it in Parliament and it plans to do so again, because with these things, I know I have been involved in campaigns against what I regarded as injustice before. It's a very long process, because people do, and in many ways rightly assume, that the outcomes of trials in this country should be respected, because we have a jury system and we have a very thorough trial and prosecution system and a fair and incorrupt police force. So if anybody's convicted, the assumption must be that they've been rightly convicted. And many people simply write to me and say, well, surely she was convicted by a jury. That's all you need to know. And I say, well, it should be. But alas, we have, for instance, the recent case of Andrew Malkinson, who spent 17 years in prison for a rape which everybody now acknowledges he didn't commit. And he was also found guilty by a jury. So these things do go wrong. And I think there is reasonable suspicion this may have gone wrong. And it's all been slowed down a bit by the fact that the Court of Appeal has actually refused Miss Letby leave to appeal. So anything that happens now depends on the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which would have to go to the Court of Appeal and say, actually, you should hear this. And again, this will take a long time. But
and this has been a week, Peter, where people have been celebrating the justice system and the sort of swift action that it's taken. Can you just take us back to this time a year ago, that first trial? You said you had doubts.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I think I kept looking at it. I'd seen cases before where I'd felt that there was a growing tendency in British courtrooms, and I cut my teeth as a reporter doing magistrates' court and Crown Court trials, to do it differently from the way they used to do. There's more emotion, it seems to me, in cases than there used to be. And also there was less of a concern for absolute hard forensic evidence. And I couldn't see that there was. And the more I've looked at it, and at the time I felt this as a suspicion, since I've done all the reading that I've described, and other people have done an enormous amount of work on this, it has actually come to me. The simple point about this case, it's very difficult for Ms. Letby's lawyers to defend her because there isn't actually a solid objective case against her. The whole thing is entirely hypothetical. It's not even clear that the babies she's accused of murdering were murdered. There was no inquest in any case which came up with a verdict suggesting foul play. And so you have that to start with. The methods allegedly used to kill these babies are extremely obscure and complex, and there is no evidence that she either used them or researched them. And this is a person who undoubtedly, without the trial, spent a lot of time on the internet. So here we have this is a fascinating quotation from the Times article, which, if you'll forgive me, I'll try and dig out here. It came from the Nick Johnson KC, who was one of the prosecutors. And he told the court, in this extraordinary case, context is everything. And then the Times reporters who wrote your big piece this morning added, in other words, there was no one piece of evidence that proved Letby to be a killer beyond all reasonable doubt. That is actually the whole problem with the case. It's astonishing to have a case where someone has gone to prison until they die, when there's not one single piece of objective forensic evidence that they did the thing for which they've been in prison.
But however, as you've said, this is what people say to you. The jury were convinced, and 15 times round they have been. Yasmin, obviously you've been listening to this conversation. Sort of makes sense to start with Peter because he raised these concerns months ago. What do you make of this? And do you have some concern that this, in some ways, sort of undermines or corrodes? Even asking questions like this corrodes the confidence and respect that people have in the judicial system.
Well, it's so complicated. I remember reading the Private Eye thing, a couple of the last issue we got, and I was quite troubled by it. Troubled for both sets of reasons. One, that if there are these doubts and people are increasingly expressing them, and Peter's done it very well just now, then surely, not granting her leave to appeal is problematic. But there's also, I think I'm always very wary of kind of the way momentum builds up in one direction or another. And the momentum that got us to the point where they were talking about Lucy Letby as one of the worst serial killers in this country, blah, 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 was so in one direction. And I never had doubts because, I was part of the herd then. Now that all this is happening, and I haven't read the New York piece, I'm still concerned that it's what's happening, and especially as conspiracy theories online, I'm talking about, not these sober pieces we've had in the mainstream media, create a new atmosphere. And, there's this whole thing about let's solve crime cases. There's a huge kind of trend in that. And I know that some of the people who gave evidence, her colleagues, especially the doctors, were genuine people. I don't think they were setting her up or anything. Some of them, medical experts, have said that since all of this began, they've been seriously targeted. And we are living in those times. So I do think now that allowing her leave to appeal, it would be the fairest way forward. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to get lost in this forest, this noise of outrage. And the case is too serious for good human beings to let that happen. So leave to appeal would be my answer, really.
I think that the challenge is, Peter, that Peter Skelton Casey, who's representing some of the families of Letby's victims at this upcoming public inquiry, and just to give you the voice listening at home from the families, they've said, I think unless you've sat in court and listened to every piece of evidence, you've seen her on the stand, and you've seen her take the stand, you can't make that judgment unless you've lived it. So obviously we do not have anything like the context of those people. But Peter Skelton said that this campaign, talking about the questions we're talking about now, is the work of conspiracists. I mean, are you nervous that this does play into the idea that conspiracy theories can kind of catch fire and be taken seriously when sometimes they shouldn't?
I don't know what conspiracy theory he's referring to. Certainly none of the people who I've referred to in the trade of journalism who've raised this have made any suggestion of any sort of conspiracy or I mean, I know conspiracy theory is a term of abuse anyway, and it's for another time to discuss its use to shut people up as a term. But this simply isn't what's being said. What's being said is that there is reasonable cause to believe that the verdict against Lucy Letby is unsafe. Now, when someone is of her age and when her parents, particularly her father, who I think is 78 or the age they are, then there is, it seems to me, an urgency for the criminal justice system to say, well, all right, then there are doubts. And I think Yasmin's point that the granting leave to appeal would be a more sensible course is absolutely right. Here is a thing which is built into the criminal justice system of this country. You can appeal. But the first response of the Court of Appeal, it seemed to me, was very much to prefer procedure above anything else and to say, well, we haven't really got a reason to appeal. I think that perhaps within 2 or 3 years, maybe sooner, if those who are campaigning for a reopening do well, within 2 or 3 years, the Court of Appeal will grant leave to appeal, and there will be an appeal. And I have strong hopes that if there is one, then the conviction might be set aside. I don't know that it will, because I don't know or claim to know that Lucy Letby is innocent. As I say, I'm just worried that the verdict as it stands is unsafe, that evidence hasn't been produced which justifies the verdict, and it simply cannot, to me, and I think this is the problem for any person of conscience in any country where there are prisons, to imagine that there are people in prison who are there who shouldn't be is bad enough. But to have a stronger case as this of somebody who's not been sent to prison, until she dies, and there's no movement in that. That's the way it goes, unless something changes in the legal system. Sent to prison until she dies, and I have doubts about whether she's guilty. I have to, as someone with a voice and a platform, I have to say this is wrong and something should be done about it. Now, if at the end of a serious re-examination of the legal process, it's concluded that there is sufficient evidence, particularly objective evidence of her guilt, then obviously that's the end of it. But as long as things stand as they do now, it seems to me that the legal system would be wiser to reopen it. And I have been very careful. I have colleagues who disagree with me totally about this. I'm always polite to them and will continue to be. I respect their opinions, and I think they're entitled to respect. It's perfectly possible to have differing opinions on this, and I don't call any of my opponents names of any kind on this matter. It should be resolved in the most rational and cool way possible, and without any of that sort of thing. And nobody is right all the time. Even British justice isn't right all the time. We know it's not right all the time because we've had far too many cases where it's made very, very serious mistakes. And honestly, people say, well, if there's a death penalty, it would be worse because you'd kill them, it'd be irreversible. Actually, taking 5, 10, 15, 20 years of someone's life away is pretty bad. They never get it back. And it's not something you can take lightly. And if you are worried about it, then you have to raise your voice about it. And I do slightly resent having it suggested I'm part of some kind of conspiracy when I do so.
Understood. You've laid out the case very clearly here.